You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. Welcome back to the Archetype Effect. I want to start today with something I hear all the time. It usually sounds something like this. I hate self-promotion, or I just want my work to speak for itself. Maybe you've said something similar. I know I have. And on the surface, those statements sound admirable. They sound humble, professional, grounded, almost principled. After all, surely good work should speak for itself. Surely the person doing the best work should naturally become recognised, shouldn't they? A few years ago, I was coaching a woman I'll call Sarah. She just led one of the biggest projects of her career. It was delivered on time, under budget. The client was delighted. Her team thought she'd done an incredible job. A few weeks later, an email landed in her inbox announcing a new strategic working group. Exactly the sort of opportunity she'd been hoping for. Someone else had been invited. She sat in my office looking genuinely confused and said, "Ros, I don't understand. I thought I was doing everything right." There wasn't anger. There wasn't entitlement. Just genuine confusion and sadness. Because she'd worked hard, she'd stayed humble. She deliberately avoided talking about herself because she didn't want to seem arrogant. And yet somehow, she'd become almost invisible. I wonder if you've ever had your version of that moment. Perhaps not a strategic project. Maybe it was a promotion, a leadership opportunity, a client, or simply watching someone else receive recognition for work that quietly you knew you were capable of doing too. At the time, Sarah assumed she had a confidence problem. Maybe she needed to speak up more. Maybe she needed more executive presence. Maybe she simply needed to be more assertive. But as we unpacked what had happened, she realised she'd been trying to solve the wrong problem. It wasn't a confidence problem. It was a visibility problem. And here's what I've noticed after nearly 4 decades of working with leaders across all kinds of organisations. The people who make the greatest contributions aren't always the people who become known for it. And the people who become known for it aren't always the people doing the greatest work. That's an uncomfortable truth, not because it's unfair, although sometimes it is, but because it challenges one of the first stories many of us were taught about work. Do good work. Work hard. Keep your head down. Results will speak for themselves. And for a while that often works, especially early in our careers. Competence is visible because the work itself is visible. You finish the report. You run the workshop. You deliver the project. You solve the problem. People can see what you've done. But as leadership becomes more complex, something begins to change. Your value is no longer measured only by what you personally produce. It's measured by how people understand your contribution, how they describe you when you're not in the room, whether they think of you when opportunities arise, whether they trust you with something bigger. That's a very different thing. And I think this is where many women begin to feel deeply uncomfortable, because somewhere along the way, visibility became tangled up with self-promotion. As though speaking about your work somehow diminishes it. As though allowing people to see your contribution is the same as attention seeking. They're not the same thing, not even close. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Imagine you spent months restoring a beautiful old lighthouse. You repaired the walls, strengthened the foundations, polished every window and every lens. Everything works exactly as it should. Except you never switch on the light. Would anyone say a lighthouse was arrogant because it became visible? Of course not. The light isn't there for the lighthouse. It's there so other people can navigate. I wonder whether we've misunderstood visibility in much the same way. Perhaps visibility isn't something we do for ourselves. Perhaps it's something we do so other people can understand where value exists. That's a very different motivation. And I think it changes everything. Because visibility, at its healthiest, isn't about attracting attention. It isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It isn't about constantly talking about yourself. It's about reducing ambiguity, helping other people understand what you care about, what you're contributing, what problems you solve, what perspective you bring. Without that understanding, people fill in the gaps themselves. And that's what today's episode is really about. Not how to become more visible, but how recognition actually happens inside organisations. Because once you understand that process, visibility starts to feel much less like performance and much more like communication. I'd like to leave you with one thought before we move on. Visibility isn't about being noticed. It's about being understood. And once we understand how that happens, we can approach it very differently. So if visibility isn't about self-promotion, how does it actually happen? Because I think this is where many of us have been working from a mental model that simply doesn't match organisational life. We imagine it looks something like this. I do great work. People notice. Opportunity follows. A straight line. Simple. Logical. Fair. But organisations rarely work like that. Instead, recognition travels through people. Over the years, I've come to think of it as a pathway. Not a straight line, a pathway that every opportunity travels along. It has 5 stages: contribution, observation, interpretation, reputation, opportunity. Every opportunity you've ever received has travelled through these 5 stages. I almost imagine them as stepping stones across a river. Contribution, observation, interpretation, reputation, opportunity. Most of us spend years polishing the first stone, without realising every opportunity sits on the other side of the 5th. Let's walk across these stepping stones together. The first is contribution. This is where most of us are incredibly comfortable. Doing excellent work, solving problems, leading projects, supporting clients, helping colleagues, creating value. It's the part we can control. And if you're anything like many of the women I work with, it's also the part you've been taught matters most. Work hard, deliver quality, be reliable. Contribution is important, essential in fact, but contribution is only the beginning of the story. The second stepping stone is observation. Someone has to see enough of that contribution to know that it happened. Not every detail, every meeting or every hour you've worked, but enough to understand the value you created. And here's where many women unintentionally disappear. They assume the work will naturally become visible. And sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. Think about all the leadership work that happens behind the scenes. The difficult conversation you had before the meeting. The relationship you repaired. The conflict you quietly resolved. The hours you spent thinking through a decision before anyone else even knew there was a problem. Some of the most valuable leadership work is almost invisible by its very nature. Then we arrive at the third stepping stone, interpretation. And this is where something fascinating happens. People don't simply observe your work, they interpret it. They begin attaching meaning to what they've seen. She's someone who stays calm under pressure. He's brilliant with difficult stakeholders. She's incredibly strategic. She's someone who can lead change. Notice what's happening. People aren't simply observing facts, they're creating meaning. If our last episode taught us anything, It's that we don't experience reality directly. We experience the meaning we make of reality. And organisations are no different. They're constantly making sense of the information available to them. Then comes the fourth stepping stone, reputation. Over time, these interpretations become your reputation. Not the reputation you've carefully crafted, but the reputation that naturally exists in the minds of other people. It's what people say when someone asks, "Who should we involve?" Or, "Who do you trust with this?" Or, "Who's ready for something bigger?" These stories become mental shortcuts, and those shortcuts shape decisions every single day. Finally, we've reached the fifth stepping stone, opportunity. Opportunity doesn't magically appear. It appears because someone joins the dots. They think of you, they remember you, they trust you. Your name enters the conversation. And I think this is the hidden rule. Most of us believe opportunity follows contribution, but organisations don't really work like that. Opportunity usually follows reputation, and reputation is shaped by the meaning people make of our contribution. When Sarah came into my office, she believed the missing piece was confidence. It wasn't. She'd already done exceptional work. The gap wasn't between competence and opportunity. The gap was between contribution and recognition. People simply didn't have the full picture. Now, I want to be careful here. Sometimes organisations genuinely overlook people. Sometimes bias exists. Sometimes politics get in the way. Sometimes opportunities aren't distributed fairly. Understanding visibility doesn't magically remove these realities. But even in healthy organisations, people can only make decisions based on what they know. They're busy, they're juggling competing priorities, they're making dozens of decisions every day. If your contribution remains largely invisible, they don't necessarily assume you aren't capable. More often, they simply don't think of you. And that's a very different problem. But it's also a much more solvable one. This isn't about becoming louder or becoming more impressive. It's about helping people connect the dots, helping them understand what you're contributing, the thinking behind your work, the outcomes you're creating, the value you consistently bring. That's not self-promotion, that's reducing ambiguity. And good leadership almost always involves reducing ambiguity. So perhaps the question isn't, how do I get people to notice me? The better question is, how can I help people understand the contribution I'm already making? Because once you ask that question, visibility starts to feel much less like performance and much more like leadership. So now that we understand how recognition actually happens, the obvious question becomes, so what do I do differently? And I want to make this as practical as possible. Not because there's a formula, because there isn't, but because there are some small shifts that make it much easier for other people to understand the value you're already creating. Notice I didn't say, make yourself look more valuable. I said, help people understand the value that's already there. That's a very different intention. I'd like to share 3 practices that I see effective leaders using all the time. And interestingly, most of them don't even realise they're doing it. You can download this episode's field guide via the link in the show notes. Practice 1. Narrate the work, not yourself. Many women wait until a project's completely finished before they mention it. And sometimes they never mention it at all. They assume people will somehow know. Instead, bring people along the journey. You might say, we've been exploring a different way to approach this problem. Or, one thing that's emerging from the project is. Or, something we've learnt this week is. Notice what you're doing. You're not saying, look how clever I am. You're making your work visible while it's still unfolding. That gives people something to observe. It moves your contribution onto the second stepping stone. Observation. Practice 2. Share your thinking, not just your achievements. This one is subtle. When people become known inside organisations, it's rarely because they completed a lot of tasks. It's because other people begin understanding how they think, the questions they ask, the patterns they notice, the judgment they bring. Think about the leaders you admire. You probably don't remember every project they delivered, but I bet you remember the way they think. Perhaps they simplify complexity. Perhaps they ask the question no one else thought to ask. Perhaps they stay calm when everyone else becomes reactive. That's what becomes memorable. So instead of only reporting outcomes, start sharing your reasoning. One thing that influenced my decision was, the pattern I've been noticing is, I think we're solving the wrong problem. Those kinds of conversations build far more than visibility. They build credibility. Practice 3. Finish the story. This is probably the one I see missing most often. Someone completes a fantastic piece of work, then immediately moves on to the next thing. No one ever hears what happened afterwards. The impact disappears. Instead, close the loop. Tell people what changed because of the work. The client has now adopted the recommendation. We've reduced turnaround time by 2 weeks. The team is using the new process every day. It's already saving us time. You're not claiming credit, you're completing the story. You're helping people connect your contribution with organisational outcomes. And that's incredibly important because leaders aren't simply recognised for being busy, they're recognised for creating impact. Now you might be listening to this and thinking, Ros, this still feels uncomfortable. If that's you, I completely understand. Because for many women, visibility isn't just a communication skill, it's a nervous system experience. Being seen can feel risky. If you've ever worried about being judged, criticised, seen as arrogant, too ambitious, too much, then of course visibility feels uncomfortable. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's trying to keep you safe. So if this feels uncomfortable, please don't interpret that as evidence you're doing something wrong. Instead, treat it as information. Notice what story your nervous system is telling you. Notice the moment you decide not to speak, or not to send the email, or not to mention the outcome. Become curious about that moment, because awareness creates choice, and choice creates influence. So this week, I'd like to invite you to try one small experiment. Not a huge behavioural change, just one experiment. Choose one piece of work you've been involved in. Ask yourself, where am I on the recognition pathway? Has my contribution actually been observed? Have people understood what it meant? Do they know the impact it created? If the answer is no, what's one small thing I could communicate that helps connect the dots? Not to impress anyone, simply to reduce ambiguity. Because that's what visibility really is, helping people understand the value that's already there. And I think that's one of the quietest forms of leadership there is. Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. When women tell me they don't like self-promotion, I believe them. Most aren't trying to become the loudest voice in the room. They're trying to be authentic. They're trying to let their work speak. They're trying not to take credit that belongs to other people. These are good instincts. The answer isn't to lose them. The answer is to separate humility from invisibility, because they're not the same thing. Humility says, this wasn't just me. Invisibility says, no one needs to know I contributed. They're very different choices. One builds trust. The other quietly limits opportunity. And perhaps that's the biggest reframe I hope you'll take away from today's conversation. Today, we've explored 3 simple ideas. First, visibility isn't self-promotion. It's helping other people understand the value you're already creating. Second, recognition doesn't happen by accident. It follows a pathway. From contribution to observation to interpretation to reputation and ultimately to opportunity. And finally, visibility isn't about changing who you are. It's about making it easier for other people to recognise what is already there. Because visibility isn't something you do after you've done good work. It's part of helping good work have the impact it deserves. It's how ideas spread. It's how capability becomes recognised. It's how trust develops. It's how opportunities begin. And perhaps most importantly, it's how other people discover that you're someone they can rely on. So this week, don't ask yourself, how can I become more visible? Instead ask, what contribution have I made that deserves to be better understood? It's a subtle shift, but I think it's a profound one. Because visibility isn't about asking people to admire you. It isn't about creating an image. It isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about making it easier for other people to recognise the value that's already there. Visibility isn't about being noticed. It's about being understood. And once you're understood, the conversation inside the organisation begins to change. This week, think about one piece of work you're genuinely proud of, something you've contributed to, and then ask yourself, where is it on the recognition pathway? Has the contribution been seen? Have people understood what it meant? Do they know the impact it created? If not, what's one small thing you could do this week to help connect the dots? Not to impress anyone, not to claim all the credit, just to make the value easier to understand. Sometimes the smallest act of visibility creates the biggest shift in opportunity. Now, there's something interesting that often happens next. Once women begin becoming more visible, another fear often appears, a much quieter one. If I become more visible, will people still like me? It's one of the biggest tensions I see in leadership. The tension between influence and being liked. Because many women have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that being more visible can sometimes change how other people respond to them. So next time we're going to explore one of the most persistent hidden rules of work. Why being liked doesn't always create influence, and why influence doesn't have to cost you your relationships. Until then, take care. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.